Welcome to Cross Section, conversations at the intersection of faith, news, and culture. We are excited to be on YouTube. Please subscribe to the Evangelical Alliance YouTube channel to never miss an episode.
Coming up in this week's episode, we discuss two-tier policing as we look at some pretty significant changes to our criminal justice system. And is motherhood integral to womanhood? We react to a recent article about artificial wombs. This is an episode not to be missed. Hello and welcome back to Cross Section. We are very excited to all be together in the studio today. I am joined with Danny and Alicia. Hello, both of you.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
Nice to see you both. Danny, did you have a good time in Albania last week?
I did. It was mostly work, but it was great.
Good. So before we get into our main stories, just a small one that's caught my eye this week that's just a nice encouragement, is the fact that Disney have got a new Pixar series coming out called Win or Lose, and in it is a Christian character for the first time in 20 years. It's a young girl who is struggling with insecurity and self-doubt, and she's seen praying and leaning on her faith in the Lord. So that's exciting. Just a nice small story before we get into some heavier ones, and encouraging that actually Disney is seeing that representing a Christian is actually a cool thing to do. Do you think you'll be watching it, Danny, when it comes out?
I may do. I have small children. I might do. But actually, possibly more interesting is that at the same time, they reportedly have removed a trans character from the show. Maybe it's a sign of some of the, trying to please different people potentially in Washington, in powerful places. There does seem to be somewhat of a more of a right-wing swing to big tech, big media companies. It's a different environment.
Yeah, definitely. Will you be watching, Alicia?
No. Honesty on this podcast.
No, that's what we appreciate. But yeah, so if you've got kids or if you just like animated series, then get excited about that. I'm sure it will be coming out later this year. So that's exciting. But I will now move us on to our first main discussion. We are going to be revisiting the conversation around international affairs and everything that's kind of going on globally. I don't know how you're finding the news at the moment. I personally am finding it very overwhelming. Every day it kind of slightly feels like I'm having to look at it with like as if I'm watching a horror film, barely looking past my hands because I'm trying to hide my eyes. It feels like quite a fragile, bleak place. But we just thought we would kind of do, as we are recording on Thursday lunchtime, this will come out tomorrow, just a quick rundown of kind of where we're at, what's happened this week. But it is changing every day. So I'm very aware that as we record this now, things might be looking different as you are listening to us. Danny, what's kind of happened this week with Ukraine?
Well, everything's happened. And I think we'll probably get to the fact that so much is happening and it's so challenging sometimes to know how to respond and how to engage when things move so fast. As you say, I was away at the end of last week and over the weekend, and I woke up one morning to find, it's all changed again. And the breakfast table conversations are about what happened in the White House last night, what happened with the meeting with Trump and Zelensky. Keir Starmer's own visit to the White House now feels like an awful long time ago. And the apparent success in getting the White House to agree and to be on side and have a favourable meeting, the invite to come over to the UK on a state visit from the King. And then Zelensky goes over there to sign a minerals deal. They seem to be actually negotiating live on camera, which Trump thinks is all for good television. And I think this difference and this change in how politics is operating, it's no longer really the stuff happening behind closed doors. It's happening in front of us. It's happening in the 24-hour news media, the social media. The leaders are commenting on their platforms of choice, whether it's X or Trump's own Truth Social. It's happening so fast and everything's changing so quickly and it's happening in public. So yeah, Zelensky and Trump, things seem to fall apart. Things went wrong. Zelensky came to the UK, had a meeting with Keir Starmer and other European leaders. He then well, to be honest, slightly grovelled and said that, yes, we do want to pursue peace. Yes, we are ready to talk. Things seem to get better. Trump gave a speech to Congress, dangled out a bit of a prospect of engaging, but they've also cut off military aid. They've also cut off intelligence sharing. The UK and France and other countries are trying to work out how they can respond militarily. Can they fill the gap? JD Vance insulted small countries who don't ever contribute militarily, and then clarified that he wasn't talking about Britain or France. It's all been so hectic. There's been so much happening. And the prospects and the nature of what's going on in Ukraine, what that means for the war there. Have Ukraine got 6 months worth of military supplies? That's what I read yesterday. Do they feel like we're okay for now, but come the summer, we're going to be in a really problematic situation without the US support? And does this actually just give ammunition to Russia for what they're going to be doing, thinking actually, well, we can press on, because even if they resist now, they're not going to have the firepower to last it out. It really is changing the dynamic of what's happening in global affairs. But it's also changing how it happens, just how leaders relate to each other. And I think that's the thing that feels so destabilizing. Leaders aren't behaving how we think leaders behave, and therefore we're not always quite sure how to react and engage with it.
100%. Gosh, I thought you were going to give a briefing. That was a lot of detail. That was really helpful.
Far too much detail.
I don't actually know right up to date to this moment.
Well, I haven't actually read much news this morning, so
that just shows
I could be out of date.
How much it's changing. The fact that was up till yesterday, or like, gosh, it is feeling very uncertain. Alicia, do you kind of have any practical tips for how we can kind of face the news as Christians, clinging to the hope of Jesus, because it feels like every time we're kind of clicking on it or reading the paper or whatever, however we find our news, it just feels really scary.
Of course. I think personally, quite similar to Danny, I haven't been in all of the headlines. In fact, a friend has asked me, what's my view on China's response to this kind of a kind of trade deal that's going on in the US. And I think from a personal level, I think it's quite important sometimes to withdraw from the news. I think it's very much a part of our culture of the instant reactionary news, 24 hours, 7 days a week, and it's incredibly bleak. So if you're not up to date, don't feel any shame in that regard. And I think more broadly for us as Christians in the UK, the international global scene is going to impact people very differently. As Christians, unilaterally, we should be praying about what we're reading in the news, but I definitely am speaking to friends who attend our church and have family back in Lithuania. How they're engaging with the volatility of kind of diplomatic relations is completely different, so much that churches are raising funds and sending stuff across Lithuania in terms of support. They're on kind of standby for if there is ever a Russian invasion. And so there's a lot of, not fear, but there's a lot of practical planning of what does this mean if this escalates beyond Ukraine's borders. And I think equally there are many diaspora communities within the UK for which not just what's happening in Ukraine, but the wider conversation. Sudan was back in the news this week. Many churches and partners have either family or mission partners abroad. So I think ultimately, whilst it might seem ineffective, the prayers of a righteous person are powerful and effective. And I think it's important for us to read the scriptures ultimately, but to read it alongside the news and being like, Lord, we need your wisdom. Lord, we need courageous leadership. We need your peace in this situation. We need the truth of, rather than manipulation and all that might be happening to get the upper hand on others and other leaders. Lord, that your truth would prevail. And I think the more and more that the church within the UK does that, the more we're less despairing and more confident that the Lord is still sovereign and still in control. So our reactions is definitely going to be very different to others, but it's important to be praying.
Yeah.
And I think there's sometimes a challenge. I've been thinking a bit about this week about how much are we commentating, how much are we reflecting on the news, how much are we trying to have an opinion on everything. Like, I think it's really important that as Christians we are informed and that we are aware of what's going on in our world. I think it's important we engage, but I don't think we can have an opinion on absolutely everything. It's just not possible. And therefore, sometimes I think we need to be a bit slower to speak, a bit slower to feel like we have to say something. Now, here we are on a news and comment podcast where almost by its very nature, we are drawn to react. We're drawn to react to what's happening and what's going on. And hopefully we do that in a way that is thoughtful, that is considered, that is helpful. But it is a challenge. It is a challenge in sometimes feeling like we have to comment and we have to respond. And actually, as we were talking and discussing ahead of recording today, one of the things we talked about is international news is moving so fast and there's so much going on. We do want to talk about these big international affairs, but actually recognize that sometimes we don't have a huge amount to say. Sometimes there isn't that much new to say. I can give a 4-minute spiel about the latest ups and downs in international affairs, but actually what specific can we say to help? So I think sometimes we'll zoom in and out of international affairs. Sometimes we might dig deeper. Sometimes we might take a few weeks off. There might be a lot happening in the news, but we might just actually sit it out for a few weeks and focus on some other issues. And I think that's true for us, but I think it's true for everyone. Just sometimes being able to sit out of things and say, I'm not going to comment on this. I'm not going to engage with this. I'm going to try and wait for the dust to settle. The next few rounds of international geopolitics can move on without me.
Yeah.
Indeed.
I mean, because, you know, a lot of these stories have been very powerful figures talking to each other and arguing with each other. But also kind of behind this as well are people's lives, like people in Ukraine. I mean, last night, I think 4 people were killed. So as Christians, we can be praying for these people, for the people that are really suffering, that for them, it's not kind of, you know, our engagement can be, looking at the news and then thinking about it or talking about it, but also we're not living in it. We're living in the kind of feelings of the fragility, but we aren't having to live in fear in the way that some people are. So yeah, as you were saying, as we are here, we are in our own unique situation, but we can definitely be praying. And Psalm 46:2 says, therefore we will not fear though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea. We have got a God that is bigger than this and is completely stable in a very unstable world. So yeah, I encourage you to kind of bring your fears, but also to be praying for our brothers and sisters and people across the globe that are really suffering right now. So on to our next story. This is something that's really kind of captured the news in the last couple of days. The Sentencing Council have revealed that magistrates and judges should normally consider ordering a pre-sentence report on an offender if they come from an ethnic minority, a cultural minority, or a religious minority, or if they're transgender. This is quite interesting. What are our initial reactions to this?
Well, this is interesting, and you've given it the proper introduction of how this is. The way this has burst onto the news media has been, this is 2-tier care. This is different sentencing for people of ethnic minorities, people who are young or people who are trans, and maybe only white Christian men are going to get full tariff sentences. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, I have the sentencing guidelines in front of me. These, as you say, this is about the preparation of a pre-sentencing report that informs judges on the sentencing to be given. Now, those reports sometimes do provide mitigating circumstances where shorter sentences are given, and that's why this story's cropped up. Robert Jenrick, the Shadow Home Secretary, has been raging against this. Shabana Mahmood, who's the Justice Secretary, has said, I don't want, as an ethnic minority, I don't want to be treated differently under the law. I'm going to tell them to change what they're doing. This is I think it's what's called an arm's length body. The government don't actually set these sentencing guidelines. This body sets them. Now, the government and parliament could change the law, and that's what the Conservatives are saying they should do. They could change the law and take back control of these guidelines. But at the moment, this isn't a politician-led body. It's not a government-led body. These guidelines have been produced. They come into force in April. But it's proved quite controversial.
I mean, it has. And I think the challenge that the government now face is that the headlines are out, 2-tier policing. How do you roll back with clarity around what the Sentencing Council is actually issuing? I was looking on X yesterday as a slight lull, and was captured by the headlines. Oh, this is two-tier policing. This is discriminatory at its nature, and they, clip it and show parts of the information. But then when I go and read and look, and as Danny was saying, what's the purpose of a pre-sentence report? It recognises that in some cases the offender's history and their exploration or their circumstance explains why the offence took place. And I think one of the lists that came up that kind of stood out to me more so than on the kind of ethnic minorities, cultural minorities and faith communities was talking about pregnant and postnatal. And it brought me back to probably about 10 years ago of working in the criminal justice sector and working with female offenders, where actually that narrative more often than not isn't helpful, because sometimes disproportionately through research it shows that female offenders more often have been victims of crime. They either are involved in drug addiction, they're either involved through traumatic experience, domestic abuse, and sometimes that is a causal factor for the offending that has taken place in this instance. And so of course a pre-sentence report provides clarity to the judge and the magistrate to actually say what is fair in this circumstance for this sentencing. And naturally, I would 100% would want that kind of to be considered and those facts brought into the case. But of course, the politics that the government are now having to navigate is what it appears on the surface of discriminatory behaviour, and particularly when you bring in the divide of not just ethnic minorities, but actually potentially white men, working class, and helpfully, stroke unhelpfully, Robert Jenrick bringing in Christian and polarising that against other faith communities. That's not an easy one to work back or bring clarity to the public. So I think the government are in a difficult position at the moment.
They're in a really difficult position, because I think, as you say, the idea that judges should be well informed about the circumstances of someone's life, their context, that makes sense. I think it's the fact that these reports are recommended or encouraged in some circumstances and not in others. I think that's the problem. That it says actually when the offender, I was going to say the victim, the wrong way around. When the offender is of an ethnic minority or a faith minority, I think that's where it's like, well, why should it matter in those circumstances and not in others? I think a lot of issues are important. I suspect it's simply because they don't want to be having to do this work for every single person, that they don't want to create so much bureaucracy. So it does raise that problem, that question of, are some people being treated or viewed different or given extra allowances in how the criminal justice system offers? And that's going to be, well, not just controversial, but concerning.
Of course.
So Shabana, as you've already mentioned, Shabana Mahmood has kind of gone against this. Do we think that will have impact?
Well, I think fundamentally politicians often push things away from themselves when they want someone else to take responsibility for it. And then when that responsibility isn't done in a way they like, they find themselves taking it back. It happens in all sorts of different areas. MP salaries is another one. A review board says MP salaries should be increased. So they outsource it, saying we're not the ones in charge of our salaries, but then this body says they should be increased. And MPs have to technically vote on that decision, even though the recommendation's been done externally. MPs feel like, oh, no, we need to take back control and reject that. Otherwise, people will say we're voting for our own pay rise. Politicians sometimes want responsibility, and sometimes they want to outsource it. And I think generally, politicians need to be responsible for decisions, even if in practice, most of them will be made by either arm's length bodies or civil servants, because it's not realistic for Parliament to vote on everything like this.
I mean, either way, what is definitely going to happen, as you mentioned, the Justice Secretary's written a letter to express her view and concern. How effective that will be, we will see in time. Should the Sentencing Council come back and say, we are not changing the guidelines, I think you then will see the government respond possibly legislatively to correct both the political narrative and the presumption that this incoming government kind of seems to buy into a two-tier policing, which is something they're trying to shift, because as long as that sticks, then centre-right politicians are able to encroach and kind of win ground in very fragile seats in the lead up to local elections. So there'll be a reaction for sure. We shall see.
Yeah, 100%. Do you think this will also have impact on kind of the public's confidence in the justice system and how people view that?
Well, I think it does. As Alicia said, it does potentially feed into this idea that people aren't treated equally, that actually people's characteristics are more important than the crimes that they've committed. Sentencing is a fraught business. It is rare. Sometimes you look at it and say, well, why did someone get 6 years in jail for that, but only 6 months suspended sentence for this other thing? It's a really tricky thing. But I think the fact that this has been raised in the way it's been raised this week means that work does need to be done to restore and to ensure there's confidence in the criminal justice system, that it does operate fairly and that people can trust it. And I think that it's an uphill struggle right now.
Yeah, this will definitely, I think watching the outworking of this will be very interesting, seeing how it kind of plays out and what that looks like. Because at the moment it's saying this will start, I think, on the 1st of April.
Yes.
Which is really soon. That's in like 4 weeks. So we will see what happens. You are listening to Cross Section, the podcast where we discuss all the things that are happening politically, culturally, in the news in light of being Christians. Please do get in touch with us. We really do want to know what conversations you're enjoying, what you're finding interesting, what you don't agree with, what you do agree with. So please do email us at cross.section@eauk.org. Also do check us out, the Evangelical Alliance, on all different social media platforms. We would kind of love to engage with you in that way. It's also Danny's birthday.
Yeah,
as you're listening to this.
Yes, it is.
Tomorrow. So if you just want to get in touch, wish him a happy birthday, please do.
I should emphasise it's not my birthday today.
No, but as they are listening, as this comes out.
I thought I could get away with it and avoid it.
But we're not going to sing because
Please
no
don't.
one needs to listen to Alicia.
Yeah, sound hasn't been EQ'd for all singing.
No,
Please don't.
Don't want to do that to
That would be
anybody.
awkward. I would just sit here looking awkward if you did start singing.
I think it would be a disaster for all three of us. But yeah, so thank you so much for taking the time to listen or watch. We are very grateful. So I am now going to pivot the conversation onto something completely different as we move on to our final conversation for the episode. Yes, did it come out yesterday?
I think it was yesterday.
Yeah, was a Times article titled, and then in quotation marks, "Grow a baby in a bag. Gen Z backs the use of artificial wombs." You might be thinking, what on earth have you just said? Fair enough. Well, so there has been kind of a lot of research and talk about artificial wombs, or bags, as this article has referred to them, and babies kind of growing in there instead of being in the mother's womb. And Theos, the think tank, have done some research into people's public opinion about this. So they have asked how many to certain people, well, a wide range of people. I don't know the statistics of their kind of research panel, but would you support growing a fetus entirely outside of a woman's body? Now, the results show that only 21% of people were supportive and 52% were opposed to the idea. Those who were identified as religious were more likely to oppose it. But what is also interesting that the highest proportion of supportive people were aged 18 to 24. These stats do change if the baby is in the artificial womb because the mother is at severe risk in pregnancy or for the sake of the baby. And at that point, 62% are supportive of the concept. How are we feeling when we read this? What are our initial reactions?
Come back, Jesus.
I'll just say this did explode in the office when we started talking about it. Sometimes we'll chat about issues, stories, but this one really kicked off. I think it's fascinating. Now, I'm a father, so I have 2 children. I have obviously not been pregnant, so my experience...
Obviously.
But my experience of being a parent is one thing. I do not have the experience of being a mother. And I think one of the things is just how integral is this act of being pregnant, of carrying a baby, to being a mother. And I somewhat flippantly said in the office, and like, is motherhood integral to womanhood? And obviously there are many women who are not mothers. There are many women who are not for all sorts of reasons. But in terms of male and female, there is something distinctly female about bearing and carrying a baby. And I think that's interesting. And I think just understanding and thinking about the relationship between pregnancy and birth and humanity and our nature and our society, this just opens up all sorts of really interesting ethical considerations. I think it's notable and not surprising that when this is done for convenience, the percentage who support it is low, but when it is done in a medical emergency or a necessity, the percentage that support it is higher. So it's like, actually, how much is this for our convenience? How much is this to help us sustain and support life? But it raises a fascinating bunch of questions.
Yep. The first one that I probably will touch on, which was kind of reassuring that those of, it didn't say exclusively Christian, but those with kind of religious backgrounds were opposed to these to this proposal. And I think what that shows, just from straight out the gate, the difference of kind of what is one's ethical framework if God is not a part of the picture. And increasingly, it's kind of like, it seems to be expansive. You're open to exploring the consideration of a baby in a bag, which as a headline is just, it keeps triggering me, but I get the point of it. So I think first and foremost, speaking to the culture that we're living in, what frames our ethical framework around anything, and specifically around children and family? And first and foremost, takeaway, people of faith, Christians should share their ethical framework, the God story about family creation. Now, back to what was the controversial conversation in the office, and not controversial, just really dynamic in the sense of, is motherhood a prerequisite to being a woman? Now, I am a single individual, never been pregnant, but would 100% say that I'm a woman. But I think that speaks to then the sensitive nature of this conversation, that as Christians, we have to be wise in our language about what we then define as being a woman, because there are many women for who pregnancy has been very challenging, for some that cannot conceive, been traumatic for those that have gone to full term and had children, and so on and so forth. So let's not get lost in the cultural narrative of what makes a woman and therefore it's biological motherhood, because then again, the conversations that many Christians advocate, and I would say continue to advocate, is the redemptive story of adoption. Now that didn't happen to the mother and the couple in that. So I think it's a very, very challenging circumstance, and actually a bleak picture of our culture. I'm not saying Gen Z is to blame for this. I think it's very much endemic of the culture that we're living in at the moment. If it doesn't affect you, then what is your moral framework? And it can be somewhat wider. But then secondly, actually, what are the considerations around this? And I think increasingly the role of AI, artificial intelligence, technology in procreation is going to continue to be a very live topic within the UK.
I think that it depends how we put this together. So I think womanhood is integral to motherhood.
Agree.
But we know that it's not the other way around, that motherhood is a very important part for many women of their lives, of what they do. I think motherhood changes people's attitude. Like, I'm not going to speak for my wife. I can't speak for my wife. We have 2 wonderful children. Her experience of being pregnant, of giving birth, is important, and it's hers. And I think it's important we understand the challenges. I think sometimes people, for very good reasons, are reluctant to talk about it, or are careful about how they talk about it, because it's a very personal thing. But I think that act of giving birth is transformative. You have brought a life into the world, but also your relationship with that baby is really significant, and it's really important. So I think the technological side of it, that we get that there's a redemptive edge to it, that sometimes it's necessary, sometimes there are things that need to be done to mitigate when we can't, or when there's medical emergencies. But to design the body out of the process, I think that's where actually you're removing something that's really important of what it means to be human. And I think of what it means to be a woman and to be a mother. And I'm so very aware that I'm a guy talking about this, but it's interesting and it's fascinating.
It's important to the conversation,
it raises huge ethical questions, because we can know that something is helpful. We can know that something is helpful medically, but actually, do we want to promote it? Do we want to encourage it? Or do we want to accept that actually in extreme circumstances this might be necessary, but we want to do everything we can to avoid it? And I think Theos, I'm really interested. They've got a podcast, I think starts next week, called Motherhood versus the Machine. Motherhood and the Machine. It's going to be interesting. I'm going to listen to it.
Well, actually, speaking of Theos, Chinny MacDonald, who is the boss of Theos, said that many of the people are telling us that the natural processes of pregnancy and birth are key to the experience of being a mother, and that to disrupt them would be unethical, which is interesting, and I guess it's highlighting the significance of pregnancy in that process, which kind of comes back to what you were saying. And actually, there are lots of benefits to pregnancy, even just the fact, like biologically, the transferring of cells from baby to mum has huge benefits that kind of even go beyond the baby being born after 9 months and kind of continue to benefit the mother. But I think this is also interesting because, as we've touched on, both of you have touched on it, there are situations where the ideal situation of a baby being in its mother's womb for 9 months and then having a safe delivery can't happen. Like, as we know, there are times where it does go differently, and I think we've got to be really careful in not taking away the kind of worth of that mother's experience and seeing it as, because there is already can be feelings of shame around different experiences, because there are such differences in the way that many mothers experience pregnancy, and you've also touched on adoption. Like, there are other ways of that kind of mother-child relationship coming.
Can I throw in a controversial curveball just as we might be moving towards an end?
I might not catch it, but go for it.
I was going to say, we might just let this one sail away. But I think it raises questions about, well, actually, do we have the right to have children? It's a blessing for sure. But actually, there are circumstances where it's difficult and we can't. But actually, at what point do we, I don't know, say actually, it's not, what interventions are ethical and what interventions are not in pursuit of having children? And this raises questions, whether it's surrogacy or IVF or the cost of things, all of these things. Because sometimes, like, people, the desire for children, I think, is a healthy one. It's a God-given one. And for some people, that just can't happen. And yet it's actually, well, that's pain. That's real pain.
Yeah, of course.
It's really hard. But what, on the other side of the scales, do we support and encourage? And what do we say, I get the pain, but actually that's not the appropriate way to deal with the pain and to address it. And I think this ties into it. Like, what lengths do we go to put something right that has potentially gone wrong? And what lengths do we say, actually, we get the pain, but that's not a helpful way of trying to address it?
I think your point around the pain of pregnancy or the difficulties with pregnancy, I think, if anything, whether you read the article, listen to the podcast, I think we as churches need to create spaces for which these conversations can be ongoing. I think very much if a couple announces they're pregnant, it's kind of God bless you and we'll be around to provide meals as 9 months on from now. But actually, some people's journey along the way is traumatic. So how, and not to always be waiting for the church leader or for an official program to be established, but how can, in natural relationships within the church, can there be these spaces of vulnerability to just be like, I'm finding it really difficult, or this loss has been really difficult, and this conversation, just so that we as a church can start supporting the pain and people through very, very difficult situations. And no doubt there will come a time where there will be an advocacy response to this, where maybe the government will think this is a worthwhile investment moving forward. But let's start in our local churches having difficult but necessary conversations to support people through it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, as so many of the conversations that we have are, this is obviously very nuanced. And I think it does really come back to the motivation of it. Sort of, you know, if a baby is born very prematurely and this keeps them alive, that is a very different thing to someone sort of saying, I don't think I want to be pregnant, so I'm going to go for this because it's an alternative that I can now use. But yeah, I think, as you say, the podcast will be really interesting. And if this kind of carries on, who knows what this story will look like in a couple of years' time? Maybe, we will see. But But as Alicia very helpfully said, I think some of these conversations are really hard to have in churches, but these are things that so many people in our congregations will be facing and often not talking about. So let's be loving people well and creating space for conversations around so many elements of motherhood, parenthood, and womanhood as well. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. We've covered a lot of things. I feel they've all kind of reflected ways that this world is a really difficult place, and that a lot is changing. Things looked very different 5 years ago. Right now they're looking very different from a month ago, but our God is consistent in all of that. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you two for your contributions, and have a good week. Be blessed.
Hi, Alicia here. Thank you for checking out this episode. If you like it, please make sure to subscribe or share with a friend and leave a review. Till the next episode, take care and God bless.